The elderly woman discovered a baby left on her doorstep and, without hesitation, decided to raise him. Many years later, when he required surgery, the nurse uncovered something during the examination that left the woman deeply shaken. On a typical afternoon in the heart of the United States, Jeffrey was walking home, his boots kicking up stones along the dirt path. It was a modest home, yet it radiated warmth, largely because of the constant presence of his mother, Rebecca. Each of Jeffrey's steps sent a cloud of dust into the air, a quiet symbol of the rebellion he carried inside. As he neared the fence marking the edge of their small property, his eyes were drawn to the old, worn boards that Rebecca had often asked him to repair. "Jeffrey, I see you've finally decided to look at the fence," Rebecca called from her spot, her voice tinged with hope and concern. "It's about time to fix it, don't you think?" Her words hung in the air, carrying a subtle mix of anxiety and anticipation. With a sigh of indifference, Jeffrey responded without turning to face her. "Oh, sure, because the fence is the biggest issue we have, right? Maybe if we spent less time worrying about how things look and more on what really matters, you'd see the bigger picture." His tone was a blend of sarcasm and frustration, reflecting the ongoing tension between him and his mother, who, to him, seemed overly focused on trivial matters. Rebecca took a step closer, her concern clearly written across her time-worn face. "It's not just about the fence, Jeffrey. It's about learning to follow through with what you start. It's about taking responsibility for the place we call home." She paused, hoping he would understand, but the emotional distance between them seemed to grow with each passing second. "You may not get it now," she continued, her voice firm but faltering slightly, "but these little responsibilities teach us important life lessons." Jeffrey glanced at the fence again, shaking his head in disbelief. "Important lessons, huh? Like blindly following rules without asking questions? Because that's what you're really trying to teach me, right?" His words dripped with defiance, his rebellion as thick and heavy as the air surrounding them. Rebecca's heart clenched at his response.
"No, Jeffrey.
What I'm trying to teach you is responsibility, care. But it feels like every word I say just pushes you farther away." Her voice cracked a bit, betraying the emotions she worked hard to suppress. For a moment, Jeffrey hesitated. The weight of his words seemed to hit him, and his rigid posture softened slightly. But then, his pride took over again as he quickly added, "Maybe I'm pulling away because there's nothing here for me anymore. Maybe I'm searching for something that this house, this fence, will never give me." With those words, laced with a bitter finality, Jeffrey turned his back on Rebecca and walked away, leaving her to wrestle with the pain of seeing her son drift away. Not just physically, but emotionally as well. He was on his way to meet some friends at the town center, and hours passed before he finally returned, walking back to the house with his mother by his side. By his side was also Angela, his new girlfriend. Her hair carelessly draped over her shoulders, and her clothes, rebellious against the town's conservative standards, spoke volumes about her carefree attitude. She stood out in stark contrast to the simplicity of the small town, her casual demeanor and infectious smile marking her as someone who seemed untouched by the world's expectations. As they drew closer to the house, Angela didn't hesitate to make her presence known, her loud laughter breaking the usual evening calm. Jeffrey, used to her behavior, cast nervous glances at the house, unsure of how his mother would react to this uninvited guest. "Wait until you see your mom's face when we walk in," Angela said with a mischievous grin. "I bet she didn't expect you'd bring someone like me here." Jeffrey smirked, part of him relishing the reaction he was sure to provoke, while another part of him worried about the consequences of Angela's bold presence. "She'll manage," he muttered, though the words were more a hope than a guarantee. "Just try not to be too yourself, okay?" His plea was a faint attempt at keeping the peace, but deep down, he knew it was pointless to expect Angela to tone down her personality. As they entered the house, Angela's presence instantly dominated the space. Her energy was almost overwhelming as she settled into the living room, as if she belonged there, kicking her boots onto the clean carpet. "Mom, this is Angela, my new, let's say friend, who's come from the big city." Hope you get along, Jeffrey said, his tone a mixture of challenge and resignation. Rebecca, hearing footsteps from the kitchen, appeared at the doorway and assessed Angela with a careful, measured gaze. She could feel her maternal instincts flare up, sensing the potential trouble Angela could bring into their lives. "Nice to meet you, Angela," Rebecca said politely, though her words barely concealed the unease in her voice. "I didn't realize we were expecting company today." Angela, unfazed, responded with a shrug. "Oh, it was a last-minute thing. You know, life on the road. No plans, just going with the flow," she replied, sprawling on the sofa as though it were her own home, her boots still covered in dirt, leaving a mark on the spotless carpet. Rebecca noticed every small sign of disrespect. Angela's words, her careless actions, all challenging the order and structure she cherished in her home. "Jeffrey, can we talk in the kitchen for a minute?" Rebecca asked, hoping to have a quiet moment with her son to express her concerns without creating an immediate confrontation in front of their guest. Once they were in the kitchen, Rebecca wasted no time. "Jeffrey, I've always supported your choices, even when I didn't agree with them. But bringing Angela here, without any warning, and with the way she behaves, it's really troubling," she said, her voice thick with disappointment and worry. Jeffrey, defensive as always, met her gaze. "Angela's different, Mom. She gets it. She understands what it feels like to want to break free from this life we're stuck in. She makes me feel alive." His justification for Angela said more about his inner turmoil than it did about her, a reflection of his desire to escape the world his mother had worked so hard to create. Rebecca sighed, realizing that her struggle was no longer just with Angela's influence, but with Jeffrey's increasing desire for freedom, a freedom she feared he wasn't ready to handle. "I just want you to be happy, Jeffrey," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But I also want you to be safe, to be responsible. Angela, she doesn't seem to think about the consequences of anything, and that worries me. It's dangerous, Jeffrey." She tried to explain, her sincerity clear, hoping her son might understand. Jeffrey met her gaze, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Mom, you don't get it," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "With Angela, I can just be myself.
No judgments. No limits.
That's what I want." His words were charged with a youthful longing for freedom and acceptance, an urgent desire to break free from the confines of his life. Rebecca looked at him, her heart breaking as she saw the growing divide between them. She knew arguing wouldn't help. It would only push him further away. But staying silent felt like she was agreeing with everything he said. "All right, Jeffrey," she said softly. "Just be careful, okay? And remember, don't let anyone, especially a friend or whatever she is, take away who you are. Don't lose your roots." She kissed him gently on the forehead, trying to convey all the love and concern she couldn't put into words. Back in the living room, where Angela was already poking around the few decorations with a carefree curiosity, Rebecca tried to soften her approach. "Angela, I hope you feel welcome here," she said, forcing a smile. "Jeffrey, why don't you show her around town before dinner?" she suggested, attempting to build some kind of bridge, albeit a fragile one, between her world and Angela's. Angela jumped up from the couch, flashing a wide and confident grin. "I'd love to see what your town has to offer. Let's go, Jeffrey," she said, tugging him by the hand with an intimacy that didn't go unnoticed by Rebecca. For a brief moment, something seemed to flicker in Angela's eyes, an urgency that Rebecca couldn't quite place, but she couldn't figure out what it was. As they reached the door, Jeffrey stopped abruptly, turning around with an unreadable expression. To Rebecca's surprise, he pulled her into a hug, an unexpected gesture that left her momentarily frozen, overwhelmed with both surprise and emotion. "Take care, Mom," he murmured into her shoulder, his voice muffled. The intensity of the moment seemed to carry a weight, an unspoken meaning that Rebecca couldn't fully grasp. The hug, though affectionate, felt more like a farewell, filling her heart with worry. Before leaving, Jeffrey seemed to remember something, disappearing into his room for a moment. The sounds of zippers and items being stuffed into a backpack cut through the house's quiet stillness. Feeling uneasy, Rebecca followed, finding him hastily packing a bag. She couldn't help herself. "What are you doing, Jeffrey? Why are you taking that now? I told you not to be out too late. You don't need to bring much for a walk around town." Caught off guard, Jeffrey quickly zipped the backpack shut and turned to face her, his attempt to mask his nervousness failing. "Oh, it's just that Angela and I thought we'd camp out tonight, to see the stars," he explained quickly. His words sounded flimsy even to him, the excuse lacking any real conviction. Rebecca studied him closely, a sense of suspicion creeping into her chest. The hug, the packed backpack. It all felt like more than just a simple night under the stars. Something was off. "Are you sure, Jeffrey?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of worry. "You've never mentioned camping before." Jeffrey nodded quickly, avoiding her gaze. "It was Angela's idea. Don't worry, Mom. Everything's fine. I promise." Without waiting for more questions, he grabbed the backpack and rushed out the door, leaving Rebecca alone with a growing sense of fear and uncertainty. When the door shut behind him, the silence in the house seemed to stretch out, deafening. Rebecca made her way back to the living room, each step feeling heavier than the last. She sank into a chair, staring out at the empty house, suddenly too large to feel empty. "What are you planning, Jeffrey?" she whispered to herself, her words barely audible. Could he really be thinking about leaving? But why now? Why would he want to leave everything behind? A wave of panic and fear washed over her, and self-doubt crept in. I should have noticed the signs. I should have seen something was wrong. The thought that Jeffrey might be planning to run away with Angela, leaving everything, leaving her, filled Rebecca with an overwhelming sense of dread. Why would he want to run? Wasn't I a good mother? The questions swirled in her mind, each one sharper and more painful than the last. She paced the room, replaying every conversation, every look, every moment in recent days, searching for a clue she had missed. Maybe I should have pushed less, listened more. Maybe there's something Angela offers that I couldn't give him. As night fell and darkness wrapped the house in its quiet embrace, Rebecca remained awake, her eyes fixed on the road outside, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that Jeffrey would return. She wanted to see him walk through the gate, under the faint glow of the streetlights, and for her worries to end in the comfort of his presence. But as the hours dragged on, the silence deepened, and her hope began to fade, like smoke carried away in the wind. What if he really left? What if I've lost him forever? The thoughts tumbled through her mind, a storm of fear and regret that offered no reprieve. Meanwhile, Jeffrey and Angela had taken a brief taxi ride to a neighboring town, where they found a small rental house, a world completely different from the one Jeffrey had been desperate to leave behind. The house, though modest and showing signs of wear, became a haven for the two of them, a place where they could live on their own terms. One evening, as twilight settled into darkness and only a dim lamp illuminated the kitchen, where Jeffrey and Angela shared a makeshift meal, Angela's demeanor shifted. She placed her hand gently over Jeffrey's, her eyes unusually serious. "Jeffrey," she began, her voice hesitant. "I need to tell you something." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing.
I'm pregnant.
The words hit Jeffrey like a bolt of lightning. Pregnant? The word echoed in his mind, bringing a rush of emotions, surprise, fear, and then, unexpectedly, a sense of acceptance. He looked at Angela, whose eyes searched his, waiting for his response, his reaction. "You're pregnant," Jeffrey repeated in disbelief, the words slowly sinking in. "We're going to have a baby." The months that followed blurred into a whirlwind of preparations, plans, and growing anticipation. Jeffrey, who had left his home driven by nothing more than the desire for freedom, suddenly found himself face to face with the reality of becoming a father. He took on various temporary jobs, putting aside every penny he could for the baby on the way. Meanwhile, Angela transformed their rented house into a cozy home, each corner reflecting the love and excitement they shared for the new family member. The life Jeffrey had once dreamed of, A life free from responsibility and constraints, seemed to slip away, replaced by a new reality, one where he eagerly anticipated the cries of a newborn, sleepless nights, and those quiet moments of joy that only a child could bring. Yet, even as the days passed, Jeffrey often thought about Rebecca, wondering how she would take the news. I don't know if I should tell my mom. It's been months since I left without a word. A part of him longed to share his joy, his fears, and the whirlwind of emotions with her. But his pride, born from the distance he'd created by leaving so suddenly, held him back from reaching out. The day of the birth finally came, and Jeffrey and Angela entered the hospital hand in hand, a mixture of nervousness and excitement hanging in the air. Angela was quickly taken to the preparation room, and Jeffrey was left alone in the waiting area, his heart pounding as each minute seemed to stretch on forever. Every footstep in the corridor made his heart race as he waited for the news that would change his life forever, that he was now a father. The hours passed slowly, each one heavier than the last, until finally, a doctor appeared with a tired but genuine smile. "Congratulations," the doctor said warmly. "You have a healthy baby boy." In that moment, all the anxiety and fear that had gripped Jeffrey's heart melted away, replaced by a flood of joy that words couldn't fully express. When Jeffrey entered the room where Angela rested, almost unconscious but holding their tiny bundle, he was overwhelmed by the rush of emotions. He stepped closer, gazing at his son's face for the very first time, tears of happiness filling his eyes. "He's perfect," Jeffrey whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. As he looked down at the little one, wrapped in a soft blanket, he felt the overwhelming power of new beginnings, a fresh chapter in his chaotic life. Angela, though exhausted, gave him a radiant smile, her eyes reflecting the same love and admiration for the family they had created. But before they could bask in their joy any longer, an insistent beeping from the machines by Angela's bedside cut through the moment. Jeffrey froze. The heart monitor displayed a flat line, a terrifying sign that something was terribly wrong. "Angela," Jeffrey called, his voice trembling as he turned to her. But there was no response. Her eyes were closed, her face pale. Confusion and panic gripped him as he tried to make sense of the sudden shift in their reality. "Angela!" he shouted again, louder this time, his urgency drawing the attention of the medical team. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room, taking quick action to try and save her. Jeffrey was gently pushed aside, his trembling hands still reaching for Angela. His eyes were locked on her, unwilling to look away as the cries of his newborn son filled the room, echoing his own desperation. Despite the frantic efforts of the medical team, their attempts to resuscitate Angela failed. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the baby's cries and Jeffrey's muffled sobs, the full weight of his loss crashing down on him. Angela, the woman he loved, the mother of his child, was gone. The void she left behind in his heart was enormous. The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork and decisions that Jeffrey had to make in the midst of his grief. When the time came to leave the hospital, Jeffrey walked out holding his son in his arms, this small life now depending on him completely, a living connection to Angela. When he arrived at the small rented house, the silence within was a harsh reminder of the emptiness he felt. He sat down on the couch, cradling his son and studying his face. Each tiny feature was a bittersweet reflection of Angela, a painful reminder of everything he had lost. "How am I going to do this without you, Angela? How can I be both mother and father to our son?" The weight of his new reality settled in. But then the baby's cries brought him back to the present, a sharp reminder that despite the pain, he had a responsibility now, purpose. "I promise you, Angela, and you, my little one," Jeffrey whispered softly, "I will do everything I can. I will love you, protect you, and raise you to be strong and brave, just like your mother." The words hung in the air, a silent vow to the room. As the night wore on, Jeffrey rocked his son gently in his arms, softly singing the lullaby Angela had chosen during her pregnancy. The pain of losing her was still raw, but the presence of his son gave him something to hold on to, a reason to keep going, a reason to fight. Jeffrey wasn't sure how he could do it on his own. "I don't know how to be a father," Maybe I won't even manage. Maybe it would be better for you to stay with someone who really knows how to raise you the right way. The doubts swirled in his mind, consuming him as he sat at the kitchen table, only a dim lamp casting light on his trembling hands. In a moment of clarity, Jeffrey made a decision that would change everything. With shaking fingers, he began to write a letter to his mother, Rebecca. Each word carried the weight of his love for his son, Scott, and the agonizing pain of his loss without Angela. He wrote about the clouded days of his life, feeling as though the sun had set and would never rise again. The letter detailed Scott's birth, Angela's death, and Jeffrey's heartbreaking decision to leave his son in Rebecca's care. "Mom," Jeffrey wrote, tears staining the paper. "You're the only person I trust to care for Scott, to love and protect him as if he were your own." Once the letter was finished, Jeffrey carefully placed it beside his son, who was nestled in a basket lined with soft blankets. He placed Scott gently into the basket and, with a heavy heart, got into the modest car he had bought with Angela's help. He drove through the night, heading to Rebecca's house. Each mile was a struggle, a battle against the urge to turn back, to embrace his son and never let go. But the memory of Angela, the promise he made to her in her final moments to protect their son, pushed him forward. When Jeffrey arrived at the house where he had grown up, he carefully placed the basket at the door, the letter resting next to it. A silent plea for Rebecca to understand the heartbreaking decision he had made. "I hope you can forgive me one day, son," Jeffrey whispered, his voice filled with sorrow. "I know you'll be in good hands." Without allowing himself a final glance, fearful that his resolve would falter, Jeffrey walked away into the darkness of the night, leaving behind both his heart and his son. The next morning, when Rebecca opened the door, she found Scott. Her initial surprise quickly morphed into shock, followed by a painful understanding as she read Jeffrey's letter. Each word struck her like a blow, a revelation of the heartache and loss Jeffrey had endured. The letter spoke of his inability to envision a future for himself, yet it revealed his desperate wish for a better life for Scott, one that could only come through Rebecca's care. As Rebecca read on, her tears flowed, not just for the sorrow of knowing Jeffrey was lost in his own suffering, but also for the bittersweet joy of holding Scott, a living part of her son, in her arms. She made a silent promise wherever Jeffrey might be. "I will take care of him, Jeffrey. I will love Scott with all my heart, just as I loved you. And I will wait, always wait for the day when you find your way back home." As the sun's soft light bathed the room, Rebecca rocked Scott gently, humming a lullaby she hadn't sung in years. The dawn brought with it a sense of new hope, a fresh beginning, and a vow of unbreakable love. Rebecca knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but she was certain that together, she and Scott could face anything. And perhaps, just perhaps, Jeffrey would one day find his way back to them. Years passed since that fateful morning. Rebecca welcomed Scott into her life without hesitation, filling the void left by Jeffrey's departure with nothing but love and devotion. Scott grew up under her careful, loving guidance. The secret of his origin remained known only to Rebecca, a burden she carried with both love and sadness. At 5 years old, Scott was a joyful, vibrant child. His smile could light up the darkest room, and his laughter, pure and contagious, was a constant in the home Rebecca had made for them. His curiosity knew no bounds. "Grandma, why is the sky blue?" he would ask. "What makes the wind blow?" His questions were endless, and Rebecca did her best to answer each one, delighting in his thirst for knowledge. Alongside school lessons, Rebecca taught him valuable life lessons. She shared stories about their family, though she left out the painful chapter about his father, and she instilled in him the importance of kindness, honesty, and courage. "Scott," she would say, looking into his eager eyes, "being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means facing your fears and doing what's right." Scott listened, absorbing her words as though they were his own, ready to carry them with him. As Scott grew, Jeffrey remained a distant shadow in the background of his life. He watched from afar, never revealing himself, yet always present. Whenever Rebecca took Scott out, Jeffrey would watch him play, run, and laugh, filled with a mix of joy and pain. He marveled at how much Scott had grown, how much he resembled Angela. But each observation served as a reminder of all that Jeffrey had lost. Jeffrey never approached. He stayed hidden, convinced that watching from the shadows was the best choice for Scott. He's happy. He's safe. That's all that matters, Jeffrey told himself, trying to convince his heart that he'd made the right decision by leaving Scott with Rebecca. Yet, despite his belief, the longing for his son remained, a hollow emptiness that never faded. One afternoon, as Jeffrey watched Scott play in the park under Rebecca's watchful eye, a question gnawed at him. Will he hate me for leaving? Jeffrey wondered. Will he ever understand why I made this choice? These questions haunted him, and the uncertainty of whether or not he should reveal himself to Scott one day tormented him. Rebecca, on the other hand, saw Scott's future with hope. She knew that the day when she would have to tell him the truth about his father was drawing near, but the thought of that conversation filled her with dread. How can I explain Jeffrey to him without breaking his heart? She wondered, fearful of the impact the truth might have on Scott. Despite her anxieties, Rebecca and Jeffrey each, in their own way, continued to love and protect Scott. Rebecca, with her steadfast presence and boundless love. Jeffrey, from afar, silently watching, both caring for the boy who unknowingly united their fates. The years continued to pass. Scott, now 15, carried not only the genetic legacy of his parents, but also a rebellious spirit that flourished with adolescence. He was a young man with a free soul, eager for independence, often clashing with the rules Rebecca set in place. Their arguments were heated but never disrespectful, a testament to the deep bond between them. One hot summer afternoon, their latest disagreement took place in the kitchen, as Scott expressed his desire to go to a music festival with friends from school. Rebecca, concerned about the environment and influences at the festival, tried to explain her fears. Scott, I'm only worried about you. That festival isn't the right place for someone your age, she said, her voice heavy with concern. But, Grandma, I'm already 15. I know how to take care of myself. You trust me, don't you? Scott shot back, his voice rising in frustration, though his eyes revealed more of a yearning for understanding than for conflict. I just want a little freedom. I want to make my own choices. Rebecca sighed, gazing at the young man before her, growing up so quickly. I trust you, Scott. It's the world out there that I don't trust. Deep down, she knew his desire for independence was natural, but she couldn't help the fear that gripped her heart, fear of losing him, of letting go. Just as the tension between them reached its peak, Scott suddenly went pale, clutching his sides in obvious pain. Grandma, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Something's wrong. It hurts. Alarmed, Rebecca immediately moved toward him. Scott, what is it? Talk to me, my dear. What's hurting? Let me help you. Every word Rebecca spoke was colored with concern as she watched Scott writhe in pain, his confusion and fear evident in his eyes. He tried to make sense of what was happening, but his discomfort was overwhelming. Without hesitation, Rebecca called for an ambulance, accompanying Scott to the hospital where he was swiftly diagnosed. It was an acute kidney crisis, a condition he had inherited from his mother, Angela, who had battled chronic kidney disease. Jeffrey had briefly mentioned this in his letter, but Rebecca had never imagined it would show up in Scott. As Scott received treatment, Rebecca found herself reflecting on the cruel ironies of fate, how history seemed to repeat itself in ways she could never have predicted. Why didn't I tell him about his father? About everything? She questioned herself, feeling the weight of not sharing the full truth with Scott. Perhaps if she had, he might have been better prepared to face challenges like this. While Scott rested, recovering in the hospital, he looked at Rebecca with new eyes. The physical pain had exposed a vulnerability he rarely showed. Grandma, he said softly, I didn't know something like this could happen to me. The doctor said it's hereditary. Did you know? His question was laced with fear and curiosity, an unspoken plea for answers. Rebecca squeezed his hand, knowing that the time had come to share the story she had kept hidden for so long. Scott, There's so much about your father and mother that you need to know. It's a story of love, loss, and, above all, hope. And it begins with me, with you, and with a decision that changed all of our lives. As the soft light of dawn filled the room, creating a quiet, reflective atmosphere, Rebecca sat beside Scott's bed and took a deep breath, preparing herself to reveal the truth. Your father, Jeffrey, was a young man full of life and dreams, just like you. But he had his own struggles that led him to make some very difficult choices. Scott listened with intense curiosity, but before Rebecca could continue, he interrupted. And my mother? What was she like? The mention of his parents stirred a thirst to know more about who they were and the life they had before him. Rebecca nodded gently, her heart swelling with love for the woman she was about to speak of. Your mother, Angela, was an incredible woman, strong, loving, full of life. She and Jeffrey loved you more than anything, Scott. But after you were born, she had complications. Complications that took her from us too soon. Rebecca's voice trembled as she spoke of those painful moments, but she pressed on. But your father, Jeffrey, he tried to do what was best for you, even if it meant making sacrifices. He thought he wasn't strong enough to be the father you needed, so he made the hardest decision of his life. He left you with me, thinking it was the only way to give you a better future. Scott's eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and sadness. But why didn't he ever try to see me? Why didn't he visit? Why did he just leave us? His voice was heavy with emotion, his questions digging deep into the complex feelings he didn't know how to navigate. Rebecca hesitated, gathering her thoughts before responding. I'm sure Jeffrey watched over us from a distance. He probably wanted to come, to be there, but I think he was too afraid that he couldn't be the father you deserved. He was lost in his own pain, Scott. That's just how he is. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse, Mariana, who came in with news about Scott's condition. We need to consider a kidney transplant, she said, her expression serious, preparing them for the difficult news ahead. The mention of a transplant struck Rebecca and Scott like a blow, a painful reminder that Angela's chronic kidney disease had left an indelible mark, not just on the past, but on Scott's future as well. Without missing a beat, Rebecca immediately volunteered to be tested as a potential donor. I'll do anything for him, she said, her voice firm, determined. But the tests came back, and it was revealed that she wasn't a match. Neither were any other family members or friends. The search for a compatible donor seemed more desperate with each passing day, each negative result weighing heavier on Rebecca's heart. What are we going to do now, Grandma? Scott asked weakly, his voice filled with fear. I'm scared. I don't know what will happen to me. I wish my father were here now. His words, though soft, carried the resilience that Rebecca knew he had inherited from both his parents. Rebecca held Scott's hand, her expression resolute despite the fear bubbling inside her. We won't give up, Scott. We'll find a donor for you no matter what. You are strong, like your mother and father, and together, we'll get through this. At that moment, as dawn's first light streamed through the window, Rebecca and Scott stood together in the face of uncertainty. But they knew one thing for sure. No matter how tough the road ahead, they would face it side by side. Their love and determination were unshakable, and that would carry them through any obstacle. We will overcome this, Scott. Believe in that, Rebecca whispered, offering him a tender smile, hoping to brighten the shadow of worry on her face. What they didn't know, however, was that later that morning, the hospital would bring news that would change the course of Scott's fight, sparking a new chapter of hope in what had seemed an increasingly bleak situation. The sunlight gently filtered through the hospital curtains, casting a soft, comforting glow over the room. Rebecca sat by Scott's bed, holding his hand, lost in anxious thoughts about the future. Scott's condition had become the central focus of her world, each day a blend of hope and despair. It was in this moment of reflection that Nurse Mariana entered the room. Looking at Rebecca, she began with a tone of excitement masked by professional calm. Mrs. Rebecca, she said, we have good news. A compatible donor has been found for Scott. The surgery is scheduled as soon as possible. Her voice held a formality, but it was impossible to mask the excitement underlying her words. The news hit Rebecca like a refreshing rain in a drought. Tears of relief and gratitude welled up in her eyes as she squeezed Scott's hand. Scott, now awake and curious, watched her with wide eyes. "Grandma, did you say a donor?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "We're really going to get through this?" Rebecca nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart, a donor has been found. You're going to have the surgery." Scott's eyes lit up with hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Really, Grandma? I can't believe it. We're really going to make it through this," he exclaimed, his face breaking into a joyful smile that had been missing for months. Rebecca held him close, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. "Yes, my love," she said. "God has sent us an angel, someone we don't even know, but who is willing to save your life." As Rebecca and Scott embraced, wrapped in the warmth of this renewed hope, Jeffrey watched from afar, hidden in the shadows of his own life. The discovery of Scott's condition had been a shock, forcing him to confront how invisible he had become to those he loved. But despite his guilt, a strength he didn't know he still had moved him to act. Jeffrey took the compatibility test, perhaps in a silent attempt at redemption or, at the very least, to make up for the years of absence. When the test confirmed that he was the perfect match, a wave of conflicting emotions hit Jeffrey. He could save Scott, but the fear of reopening old wounds and confronting his past made the decision feel overwhelming. Yet, with determination, Jeffrey chose to donate anonymously, insisting that his identity remain a secret. "For you, my son, I will do this with all the love in the world." The surgery was scheduled quickly, and the medical team sprang into action, preparing for what could be a new lease on life for Scott. Rebecca, still overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events, prepared her grandson for the procedure. She reassured him with words full of love and promises of a brighter future. "You're strong, Scott. You'll get through this and come out even stronger. I have faith in you," she whispered, holding his hand tightly as he was wheeled into the operating room. Her heart raced with a mixture of fear and faith as Jeffrey, from a distance, sent his silent prayers, hoping that his choice would bring Scott the health and happiness he deserved. Inside the operating room, the medical team worked with calm precision, each movement synchronized to ensure the success of Scott's kidney transplant. Among them was Nurse Mariana, whose experience had made her an observer of both the small victories and the intense moments that came with every procedure. She kept a careful eye on the surgery and often glanced at Scott, her young patient, as he fought for a second chance at life. As the surgery neared its end, the medical team began to relax. Signs that the procedure had been successful were becoming clear. Mariana checked Scott's vital signs, and a small smile crept onto her face. She exchanged a look of relief with the surgeon. "Another miracle today," she thought proudly. When Scott was finally moved to the recovery room, Mariana followed to ensure he was stable and comfortable. Meanwhile, Rebecca, filled with anticipation and hope, was allowed to see her grandson. As she entered the room and saw Scott slowly waking up, emotions overcame her. Tears of relief streamed down her face as she approached his bed. "He's doing well, Mrs. Rebecca," Mariana said warmly. "The surgery was a success. We're all so proud of Scott. It wasn't an easy surgery, but he handled it wonderfully." Rebecca could barely find the words as she nodded, squeezing Scott's hand. Then, to ease the tension, Mariana tried to lighten the mood with casual conversation. "It's amazing that the father's kidney was 100% compatible," she commented, almost absent-mindedly. "It's rare to see such perfect compatibility." Rebecca froze. A wave of shock and confusion washed over her. "What do you mean, the father's kidney?" she asked, her voice trembling. "If you're talking about Jeffrey, he never told me he was here. That can't be true." Her eyes widened as she looked at Mariana for an explanation. Mariana quickly realized her mistake. "Oh, I thought you knew. The anonymous donor was Scott's father," she said, her face full of concern for Rebecca's reaction. Rebecca sat down, stunned by the revelation. Scott, now more alert, looked at his grandmother, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. My father, he murmured softly, the news stirring confusion, curiosity, and a flicker of hope within him. As they left the hospital that day, both Rebecca and Scott were full of questions. In the days that followed, as Scott recovered, they both struggled to make sense of the new reality of their family. Scott, now aware of his father's existence and the sacrifice he had made, was overwhelmed with mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt deep gratitude for this final act of love. On the other hand, there were countless questions swirling in his mind. Why did Jeffrey choose to stay in the shadows? Why did he disappear from my life? Rebecca, equally shaken, tried to reconcile the image of the son who had left with the man who had now given Scott a second chance at life. He always loved you, Scott, she said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. In his own way, he did what he thought was best. He tried to do what was right. Rebecca tried to explain, offering comfort while leaving room for more questions. After years of silence and distance, Jeffrey had made the hardest decision of his life, to confront the past he had left behind and attempt to reconcile with Rebecca, the mother who had been left to care for their son, Scott. It was a quiet afternoon while Scott was at school when Jeffrey finally gathered the courage to approach the house he once called home. Rebecca was in the garden, lost in her thoughts, when she noticed a familiar figure approaching slowly. Her heart raced as she recognized Jeffrey, the son she had loved and lost so many years ago. "Jeffrey?" she called, her voice a mix of surprise and disbelief. "It's me, Mother," Jeffrey replied, his voice soft and hesitant, his eyes avoiding hers as if he feared her judgment and rejection. "I need to talk to you. I know I've caused a lot of pain," he continued, his voice shaking, "more than I can express, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I needed to see you. I needed to try to explain." Rebecca listened in silence, emotions flooding her heart. A storm of sadness, anger, and surprisingly, a thread of relief at the sight of her son once again. "And Scott," she interrupted, her voice firm yet caring. "Have you thought about him? He deserves to hear what you have to say. He deserves to know his father." Jeffrey lowered his head, accepting the truth in her words. "You're right. I want more than anything to talk to Scott, to be a part of his life if he'll let me." When Scott returned from school that afternoon, Rebecca gently prepared him for the meeting, explaining that Jeffrey wanted to see him. Surprised, but willing to listen, Scott agreed to meet with his father. As they sat together, Scott's initial reaction was one of cautious rejection. His posture stiff and his words measured as he faced Jeffrey, a man who had been a stranger to him for so long. "Why have you come back now?" Scott asked, his voice carrying the weight of years filled with doubts and unanswered questions. Jeffrey took a deep breath, searching for the right words to begin mending the wounds he had caused. "Scott, I know I made mistakes. I left you when you needed me the most. I was lost in my own pain, and because of that, I caused you and your grandmother so much more hurt. But I want to try to fix that. If you'll give me a chance, I want to be a part of your life." Rebecca watched from a distance, her heart a mixture of pain and hope. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long while, she believed that healing was possible. A chance for their family to rediscover themselves despite the scars of the past. Jeffrey's voice broke as he spoke, thick with emotion. "I know that nothing I say now can change the past. I lost myself. I lost you. I lost us. And for that, I'm truly sorry. More than I can express." Scott listened intently, his eyes fixed on Jeffrey, absorbing every word. The anger that had simmered for so long seemed to dissipate, replaced by a deep desire to understand, to connect with the part of his life that had always felt missing. "I always wanted to know about you," Scott said quietly, "to know more about us. Why did you leave?" Jeffrey met his son's gaze, his heart heavy. "I was scared, Scott. Scared of not being good enough. Scared of failing you just like I failed your mother. But that's no excuse. I should have stayed. I should have faced my fears with you by my side." Their conversation continued, filled with words of pain, forgiveness, and tentative hope. The foundation of their relationship was fragile, but it was real. "Scott," as he listened to Jeffrey's story, began to see beyond the absent father and into the broken man seeking redemption. "I want to try, Dad," Scott said with resolve. "I want to try to get to know each other, to be a family, and make up for all the time we lost. It won't be easy for me, but I think it won't be easy for you either. But I'll make this effort, for the family I always dreamed of having." That evening, as the golden light of the afternoon settled around them on the porch of their home, the three of them shared a moment of quiet peace. Rebecca, looking affectionately at Jeffrey and Scott, spoke from her heart. "This moment, the three of us together, is a dream I feared would never come true. My heart is at peace." Jeffrey, squeezing her hand, replied, "Mother, the strength and forgiveness you've shown me, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to offer the same to Scott. I'm here for whatever you both need." Scott smiled at both of them, a warmth in his eyes. "I grew up imagining what it would be like to have a father. Now I don't have to imagine anymore. We're together, and that's all that matters. Thank you for letting me know this part of my story." And so, the family that had once been shattered by pain and regret was reunited, stronger for the shared experience they had endured. Jeffrey had finally redeemed himself, and Rebecca, the resilient matriarch, found peace in their reunion. Scott, the link that had brought them together, moved forward with them, ready to face the future with renewed love, hope, and a sense of belonging. This is the end of their story.